So first with associations, I'm always kind of not particularly wanting to give that focus because I think it's not easily understood, especially if you're not actually in economic life. So it's my thoughts about that are, having been in business all my life and tried all sorts of things, kind of with this story in mind, where, you know, outwardly his image is that, but it's a very complex image from a modern mind. His image, first of all, is the economic life is distinct from what he calls spiritual life, our education, our religion, our interest in the arts, or whatever it might be. It's distinct also from the rights life, laws, and, you know, the proper role of parliament and so on. That's easily said, but existentially, that is a huge challenge to understand, because we live in a world where those things are not distinct. In fact, most of them are governed by politics. So the idea is not easily, you know, it's you can maybe grasp it intellectually, but your whole existence today is not talking about this. So it's not easy to understand. And secondly, so he has this in mind. First of all, the economic life is distinct from what he calls the rights life, political life, and so on, and distinct from the realm of culture and so on. And these realms, and particularly economic life, they have their own governance according to their different natures. So for most people, this is impossible. They say you're dividing society into three and it will never work. And I don't know that it's useful now to go into how he answers that. But he builds everything, in fact, on the nature of the human being. And you can kind of explore it in your own case, in one's own case, where he, for example, distinguishes between the kind of nerve sense system we have, whereby we sense things and we think, the metabolistic life, the whole life of will, how we move about, and then the life of breathing with its rhythms and so on. And he says these three things you can distinguish in yourself. And you can also distinguish, they are not the same. None of them are the same as the others. They're all distinct. And yet somehow in the human being, they're not in conflict. They're working in harmony. And to extend that, if a lot of what we have as by way as human beings, as illnesses, has a lot to do whether these three aspects of the human being are in harmony. And this is a huge topic, and a hugely important topic, because if you know you're made up of three kind of systems, if you like, at least putting it very outwardly, and you know they have different natures, then you have a huge diagnostic tool, you know. And an example that he gives, I don't think it's in the economics lectures, although it might be. If your digestive system or your metabolic system gets too involved in your sense thinking, in your thinking system, you will get a migraine. Well, if you know that, you don't need to buy pharmaceutical products half the time. I'm not saying you don't need them, but to a certain sense, I am. You just need to say, okay, so what is it that's causing my digestion to get muddled up with my thinking system, and maybe I address this issue. So it's a very simple. I could give many examples where diagnostically this threefold nature of the human being, as he describes it, and really in this is totally a sidebar, but it's an important sidebar because he builds his whole sociology on this. Also, it's based on a kind of discovery in let's say medical history, the discovery by him of this three natures and their different these three aspects and their different natures and how they interrelate. This is as important as the discovery of the circulation of blood. So it's a hugely important thing, which maybe not enough attention is paid to it, or its real significance in, you know, if you look at the circulation of blood, how that was discovered actually not here in Folkestone, but where I live. The hero of this town is William Harvey, who discovered the circulation of blood. And that's such an upheaval in the whole history of medicine and how we understand the human being. Well, Steiner's discovery of these three aspects and how they relate is of an equivalent, if not greater, significance, I would say. And it's not for nothing that he effectively says, if that's the case, the whole of social life is just a kind of outer expression or reflection of this. And so if we understand it in ourselves, we have the kind of proof by life of this. You can then kind of try and articulate it like I'm doing now, put it in words and so on. But that's only so you know, or so that I know consciously what I'm living on a daily basis. And and so, in fact, the book you mentioned a few sessions ago about the threefold nature of social life is exactly built on this notion. If the human being is threefold in this sense, then society is equally. And therefore you can come to an idea which you can validate in your own experience, that the spiritual, what he calls spiritual life, the life of culture and so on, education, religion, is of a totally different nature to the realm of politics and human rights. Not human rights is not an expression he uses, but of rights life. And again, they are different in kind to the economic life. And you're not then pulling yourself apart, you're just describing three different aspects. But the important thing is I am describing those. I am kind of made up of three things, but I am none of these three things. So you're not actually pulling anything apart. You're just identifying your own threefold nature, and you are there. By definition, you're still there. So he's not tearing human being or social life into three. He's just describing it. And if that's the case, you have, as I say, a huge diagnostic tool also in sociology and in economics. You can. I'm about to have a book published about gold and how to get beyond gold and so on. And in the course of doing the research for this book, I kept coming across what I call threesomes, just threesomes in economic life. One of them you've already mentioned or touched on. Price is a function of supply and demand. This is a threesome. There were three variables there. We'll come back to that later. And but in the course of writing this book, I ended up with 45 examples of this threesome. And as it happens, I've kind of put an image on the background here of a threesome. I'll come into that in more detail. So, so if it's true what he's saying, that social life and economic life, also even financial life, is threefold, has three separate aspects to it, then you have a huge diagnostic tool, and you can start to just pull them apart and say, well, that belongs there, and that belongs there, and that belongs there. And then once you've got that clear, you can then say, well, how in fact should they be rated? Are they in balance? And so I think all this is important, and it's much more important to start, if you want to understand about associations, so-called, it's much more important to understand all this and then start to kind of think your way out into practical life. How is that going to operate, or how does that manifest, especially in business life, in the conduct of economic life? And a way of coming into that topic is these three distinct aspects have to associate. So I already said, be careful of the word association because it has lots of connotations. And if you talk about associative economics, say in the Latin language, it will mean more solidarity. It has a kind of political, even socialistic nuance to it, which is not what he's meaning. It's more a question, for me, it's a way of describing these different aspects of my being. They have to associate. They have to be in working relationship that keeps them all in balance. And for me, it's much more important to have this image of distinct elements now working together, each respecting the other and so on. And for me, this is what I would call the beginning of thinking associatively. You also have to do it in your own case, and not muddling things up, which we often do. And An example already would be if you talk about, or if people talk about what Rudolf Steiner called associations, you immediately have to say, is this the same things that we call an association today in English? There's lots of associations, capital A. There are associations, small a, meaning a type of organization, as well as the association of footballers or whatever it might be. So you have to ask yourself, when he uses a word like this, how is this related to the same words we already have, and so on. And can it, I think, last session, one before, is it equivalent to collaborating to cooperative endeavor? And even here, I would say you have to be very, very careful at least in the English language. First of all, for example, if you would say it's cooperative, then you have to explain how is that different to the cooperative movement. So I would never say it's cooperative. I might say descriptively, it's kind of, these things have got to cooperate, but not really, because that gives to them a certain nuance, which is already belonging to the cooperative movement. And the cooperative movement has behind it an attack on capitalism. It's saying capitalism is only interested in the private profit and self-interest and so on. We have to have a different way. And so instead of you having one vote per share, you get one vote per person. I understand this, how the cooperative movement came about, in contradiction to, or in reaction to the kind of capitalism it came about in reaction to, the kind of capitalism that Karl Marx came to England and verified his every thought. If you want to really see the worst of capitalism, come to the north of England and see children going up chimneys, then you'll be very close to being, you will share Marx's empathy very rapidly, because he has all the evidence for his theory in front of his eyes. If you change that, what happened to his theory? Or if he come into a different world, if he'd gone to Owen, he created a town called Harmony in the United States. Anyway, an early 19th century guy who had all these cooperative ideas, first in New Lanark in Scotland, and then he went to the United States. If Marx had gone to see New Lanark, he wouldn't have any evidence for what he then said. So it's very important to have an image of these dark satanic mills, as William Blake would call them, this whole story that was unfolding, the worst of capitalism, the worst of the Industrial Revolution. And the cooperative movement came about in reaction to this, very understandably. But when it says to every man a vote, not to every share a vote, this is a powerful democratic concept, which you could say in Steiner's mind has no business, nothing to do with economic life. This is not a realm of democracy. So you just in that example, to say the association is the same as cooperation is a problem. It is cooperative in the sense that cooperation meant before there were cooperatives. But if you say it in link with economics, you have a huge problem on your hands, because it's nothing to do with the cooperative movement. If you choose collaboration, you have another problem, because you can play with this word, or that's got labor inside it. So this is an interesting word in terms of vocabulary. Maybe that's what he's talking about. We have to work together. But as I said yesterday, when we were looking at labor and work, when people say we have to work together, they don't necessarily mean we have to unfold our destinies in relationship to one another, which is what I think it means. So it's a nice idea. We have to collaborate. It works okay as a simple piece of plain English, but in economics it gets loaded with meaning, because labor is in the middle of this. And so you have to be very clear what you understand by labor when you use a word which includes labor in it. And that gets even worse, because if you're living in a world which is based on the labor theory of value, you have to be really clear what you're playing with here in that choice of that word. Or if you live in a world which is really labor, I was going to say labor abusive, but let's say it prefers capital over labor, which is the world we live in, you won't make friends with capitalists if you go on about labor too greatly. So it may sound like I'm making mountains out of molehills, or I'm trying to create obstacles, or even trying not to answer your question, but I don't think so. I think it's very, very complicated. And in the background, you could say you're opening yourself to a huge challenge that, and I went through all this maybe 10, 15 years ago. It was interesting, with a colleague in Northern California in the medical industry. And I can't remember what the details were, but it was an example. They were creating several hospitals together, had to finance, maybe it was an MRI machine or some hugely expensive piece of equipment. And they decided to do this collaboratively together. But they ran into anti-competition rules, because anti-competition rules, which are now so embedded all over the world, put in a word, they've come from the idea, which they get from economists, let's say politicians and people have got this idea from economists, or particularly Adam Smith, that when two people get together in economic life, they are colluding, and by definition, they're colluding against the rest of you. This is not quite what Adam Smith says or means, I don't think. But this is where he says, beware when the butcher and the baker talk to each other in the street. It's a little bit, not quite how he puts it, but that's his image. And he makes the assumption, or one makes the assumption when you read this, they're getting together to fix prices against everybody. They may be just getting together to decide what to do with their mutual surplus, which charity to give it to. But that's not allowed in Adam Smithian type rhetoric. They're only getting together, they're colluding against us. And so if you have these three hospitals, the problem was they were seen to be colluding. All they were trying to do was jointly finance a machine that none of them could individually finance. And similarly, they didn't need three machines. They need to have one in one, I think it was in one hospital, the others can access. They didn't need to buy three. But by doing this, in anti-competition laws now say you are colluding, so that is forbidden. And so it was very delicate. And we had a whole discussion about, well, are these hospitals associating? Is association in this sense, even before Steiner uses the word, you can use this in perfect ordinary English. How are we going to associate together in this enterprise or something like this? There's a kind of genius, not a very nice genius, sitting in the background all the time, waiting to pounce. Anything which is collusive is by definition against humanity. Whereas it could be, of course, there's lots of cartels. There's lots of people who collude in economic life to fix prices, to rig markets, and I don't know what. It's not that it's not a reality, but the assumption that you collude is always got a negative mood about it. And so the word association is tricky if you start there with the kind of something that's too formed and too much of a noun, for all the reasons I've already given. But in my life, I decided to stay with this, and especially my what I call my mainstream books, the ones that, not the ones that I published in my own organization, but the ones that I published outwardly, meaning they're not vanity publications. People have actually commissioned them, or they've been properly edited and scrutinized and so on. Not necessarily as well as I edit, I have to say, but anyway, they've been well edited by someone from outside with no buy-in. And so here I've used this opportunity to identify associative economics as a valid school of thought in its own right. And I decided to stay with this word because it's not usual in economics. Economics doesn't even have the solidarity version of it inside. Maybe if you go to a French university, because I think they even have a minister of solidarity or something like that in France. But in the English-speaking world, in economics, association or associative is an unknown term.